Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I am Kalman Weiser. I'm the Silber Family Professor of Modern Jewish Studies here at York University. I am also the acting director of York's Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies. And it's my great pleasure to invite you to this afternoon's event. This week is, or rather this month, is Climate Change Research Month at York University, which means that the various research units at York, Centers for Research, including the Center for Jewish Studies, have all invited speakers or to make presentations about various aspects about environmental change. And it's my great pleasure today to be welcoming Professor Tanhum Yoreh, a friend of the center, and I'll say something about that in just a moment. Before we go any further, and before I introduce today's speaker and tell you about how things are going to proceed this afternoon, I would like to begin with the land acknowledgement. It's important to recognize that many indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University's campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And I couldn't think of a more important beginning for a talk today about the environment. So let me begin by saying a few words about today's speaker. Today's speaker, Tanhum Yoreh, is assistant professor at the School of the Environment at the University of Toronto. He is the author of Waste Not, a Jewish Environmental Ethic, which was published in 2019. I was actually at the book signing debut. I remember well the event. He's a long-standing friend of the center and completed his PhD at York University, and we have great pride in welcoming him back today. He completed his doctorate in the Department of Humanities under the supervision of center members Marty Lukshin, who's professor emeritus today, and Eric Lowy, who now teaches at Bar Ilan University. He is also a personal friend and a neighbor. Literally, he lives on the same street as I do. And I should say our friendship goes back quite a long way. Not long after I first came to York, he was my TA for our introductory course in Jewish studies. So I've known Tanhum for a long time, and we're extremely proud to have him back. Let me tell you a little bit about how things are going to proceed. Tanhum will begin his presentation shortly, after which we'll have time for Q&A. Now, their chat function on your computers has been disabled, but the Q&A function works. So please submit your questions via the Q&A function. You can write us anytime during the presentation or afterwards. I will read through the questions and I will present them to Tanhum, who will respond. So without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Professor Tanhum Yoreh.
Thank you, Kalman, for that warmest of welcomes. I was had a smile on my face when you mentioned a number of the things, and so I'm particularly delighted to be back at York, albeit briefly and albeit not geographically, but still, it's great to be here and part of this event, and I'm very happy about it. I'm going to share my screen. And that should work. Okay, so my talk today is faith-based environmental action, the Jewish experience, and even here, this is sort of a gesture, as it were, an ode to my time at York University, where I TA'd for 3 years under a rotating cast of professors, Kalman Weiser, Marty Lukshin, Eric Lowy, in a course called The Jewish Experience. So I figured, why not tie that into today's talk. The image you see here, by the way, is also a good way of opening this this talk. It's an image taken from the climate strike. I guess the only one here in Toronto that happened prior to the pandemic. And here you see a banner hoisted by folks, friends from Shoresh, that says in Hebrew, Shomrei Adama, protectors of the earth or guardians of the earth. Okay, so this is what we'll cover today. Talk a little bit about connections between religion and environment, the opportunities and the barriers for faith-based environmentalism, what's going on right here in the GTA. And here I'm going to focus on places of worship rather than on faith-based environmentalism, generally speaking, and also taking a look at what's happening in U.S. synagogues. And I'll explain as we go along why I'm shifting to the U.S. to get a different perspective. And then I'll talk a little bit about the next steps. And this talk is going to talk about some broad strokes, but it's mainly going to focus on the Jewish aspects of the story of faith-based environmentalism. So I particularly like this quote from Roger Gottlieb because it's one that I use in my teaching, and it's one that I use in conversations. Though I should say that the conversations tend to go a little bit differently today than they did when I first started being interested in this intersection of religion and environment. Early, people would say religion and environment, what do those two things have to do with each other at all? And then today, it's more along like, oh, you do religion and environment, that's cool. So that's an interesting area of research. And so I'm proud to be in an area and that's undergoing active evolution as we speak, and it's an exciting field to be a part of. The reason I like this quote is because, and I guess I should read it out, for as long as human beings have practiced them, the complex and multifaceted beliefs, rituals, and moral teachings known as religion have told us how to think about and relate to everything on earth that we did not make ourselves. And the reason that I like this is because it doesn't take a position. It's not trying to be a theological connection between what's going on in the world of environment and what's going on in the world of religion. It could go either way, right? We could see that the connections could be beneficial, beneficent, and they could also be detrimental to human behavior in terms of how they unfold, depending on how we see things. I also like this quote by Gus Speth. Gus Speth is part of the Yale School of Forestry, and but he also used to be Clinton's science advisor, and it really resonates because when thinking about the environment in technical ways solely, trying to solve a problem, how do we reduce our carbon, we miss a critical part of the equation, and that's talking to people in a place that meets them in terms of their worldviews and how they experience life and the things that they care about. And if we don't get that right, the technical side isn't quite as inspirational. And so Gus Speth writes, the top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. So this isn't necessarily an invitation for people of faith to fill that void, but it's certainly based on that type of formulation. It seems clear also that religions have a big part to play in how we as humans address the various environmental crises that we find ourselves in. Okay, so what might be reasons that members of religions are part of the environmental movement? What brings them to the table? And I say that the central thing that brings people of faith to act in the area of environmentalism through a faith-based lens is the notion of responsibility. There being a moral imperative to act, and I particularly like a couple of scholars, the way that they've put it. One is looking at it as through the lens of ecoethicists, and this is the work of Donald Swear at Harvard, and he writes that essentially once you have this click in your brain that there is an environmental crisis and it compromises all our life systems, and religions are life privileging traditions. In order to be a practicing member of a religious tradition, once that switch goes off, you can't not be someone who is actively environmentally engaged. To do so would not make you a full practicing adherent of that particular faith. Now, that's obviously just one way to look at it, but it's one that I like. Specifically, obviously, there's other ways into religious environmental engagement, but responsibility, a sense of responsibility for the world, for humans, for all the created worlds, if we're looking at it through that type of lens, is something that requires people to act. So, what are the sorts of resources that religions have that make them unique actors in this area? Well, one is social capital, and for this, I point you to this nice image of the lionfish on the lower left, where we see. So, anyone who's gone diving in the Caribbean has probably encountered lionfish to one degree or another. I had a student in one of my classes that said that that was a diving instructor, and she said that in order to get her certification, she had to bring in a number of lionfish bodies in order to help solve the problem of this invasive species that is really a top predator and is not prey to any other thing in the ecosystem other than humans. And so this fish species is wreaking havoc in the Caribbean. And there's an attempt in Colombia to stop the spread of the lionfish. And they've done that by trying to integrate it into the local cuisine. And that was successful. And they had this gradual process of first bringing it into high-end cuisine and then bringing it into everyone's cuisine. But in order to really motivate people to take it to the next level, they turned to the church. And the vast majority of people in Colombia belong to the Catholic Church. And they were able to mobilize the clergy to come and preach to the people in their congregations that they should be consuming lionfish, particularly during Lent, and being able to mobilize the faith communities in order to address this invasive species is a way in which social capital can work within a faith-based context. Religions also have economic clout, and this is particularly the case with institutionalized religions. They have a lot of things to support, and that requires financial portfolios, whether it's to pay their clergy or to carry out projects or to support the maintenance of their properties. And one way that we've seen in religions mobilize, and really in some cases take the lead on on using their economic clout is through divestment from fossil fuels. Now, it certainly is not something that's universal amongst faith groups, but we're seeing things like in the United Church of Canada, we're seeing things like in the Reform Movement's investment portfolio in the United States, and things are happening in the Catholic community as well through things like the Laudato Si movement, where we're seeing an active divestment of the assets of faith communities from fossil fuels. Faith communities also have political capital. And what you see here in this lower right corner is an image of faith communities being meeting at the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow. And faith communities have been a huge part of climate negotiations in terms of trying to put a moral pressure on world leaders in order to act and make big, bold decisions on our climate. We also see that religions have powerful voices, and this is something, you know, on the lower left here, this is an image of Pope Francis with Greta Thunberg. We see here one of the leading youth climate activists, together with the leader of the Catholic Church and the author of Laudato Si on Care for Our Common Home. These are people who have a voice, and their voice resonates, and they're able to use it to propel people of faith to act in a pro-environmental manner. And here on the lower right, you'll see an image of the leader of the Greek Orthodox Church, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, Pope Francis again, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, and they also joined made a joint statement prior to the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow, urging not only world leaders but all people of faith and really all of humanity to act and make difficult decisions in order to benefit all of the created world. By the way, this issue of powerful voices is something that isn't something that's just unique to this one given circumstance. We probably have close to 100 different statements issued by different faith-based leaders, whether they're at the level of the Pope or the heads of institutions, or just other members of other faith leaders. These are things that resonate in faith communities and start to have a reverberating impact on getting people to try to see things a little bit differently, framed in a type of language that speaks to people differently than the technical language that sometimes is associated with trying to make things that ultimately have a technical impact on the world. Faith communities also have moral leadership. So here on the left, and this is something that's happened in light of Glasgow again, is members of a mosque in Glasgow who have come to put solar panels on the roof of their mosque. And here on the right, we have a blessing ceremony of the solar panels happening in Washington, DC. These are things that perhaps on an individual level have a very small impact, but if we're looking at it in a global way, and in terms of who actually is doing it, these things start to have a much greater impact and influence. And so why is that the case? You know, somebody who's walking down the street and looks at a place of worship and says, oh, I didn't realize that they have solar panels. I didn't know that they did that kind of thing. And showing that they care and doing it within the context of a religious framework are things that resonate and have and reverberate and have a knock-on effect in terms of the wider society. Having said that, it's not all rosy. There are certainly plenty of barriers to environmental engagement. And one of them is obviously a lack of interest. And there's enough people in the world that say, we don't do that. That's not us. It's not how we used to do things. In terms of entrenched habits, like we do things in a very specific way, and changing it to take into consideration this climate crisis or environmental crises, it's just not who we are. And so those remain big barriers. I think that the biggest barrier, though, is antithetical approaches, things that really stand in the way of making environmental progress. And we see that environmentalism has become a very polarizing issue. And a lot of times people's polarization comes, one, from a political perspective, but it also is influenced by religion as well. One of the challenges is this thing called religious fatalism. Everything is already written in the book, as it were, and trying to change it just doesn't work. We're humanity, and the world is on a set path. The story is written, and so why bother trying to change what's already written in the book? It's already sealed. There's also this challenge with apocalyptic thinking, and if, according to some religious perspectives, the world is going to end, it has a set end date, why bother acting? And we can even see how this has been incorporated into some fringe groups' theology, where the destruction of the world needs to happen, and it's important to actively bring it about. And so these things remain big challenges to environmental engagement. Another one is the view that environmentalism is essentially akin to earth worship, and there's no real difference between what's become a ubiquitous way of terming environmentalists as tree huggers, that the image on the left is actually commensurate to the image on the right, which are artistic renditions of Asherah poles, or what we might which might resonate to folks who are familiar with the biblical texts, that this was one of the local from the local pantheon of Canaanite deities, and so it's a little bit too close to hug the tree when we're supposed to be really cutting down the trees within this Abrahamic worldview that bring people to idol worship. In the world of Judaism, this also resonates in the way that, in a similar way, that there's the added layer of the issue of halakha, Jewish law. And the challenge here is that historically, halakha and the relationship between halakha and the environment is considered to be something extra legal. It's not covered under halakha. And in writings of contemporary rabbis, when they're trying to address environmental issues, and they're looking at halakha, and they're saying, well, it's good to act in a pro-environmental manner, and this is something that should be turned on in us by compassion and acts of loving kindness, but it's not something that can compel people to act through a halachic framework, Jewish legal framework, and so there's not much that can be done in the Jewish legal sense. Of course, that's one way of looking at it, and I've written about that recently, and I invite you to go check out my recent article in Worldviews that addresses that issue. Okay, so I don't know how much of this I'll get into. I might gloss over some of it, but what are some Jewish values that bring people to the table and that resonate within Jewish communities? One is a sense of responsibility through a reading of Genesis 2:15, and that is essentially a call for stewardship, for guarding the world, taking care of it, and that's the role of the human on Earth. And I'd be, I would, it would be unfortunate if we didn't at least mention this a little bit, is that because this year is a sabbatical year and there's a lot of Jewish environmental activism that's going on surrounding the sabbatical year. But the very fact that there is a sabbatical year, a mechanism that allows the land to rest, that calls for things like social justice and a remission of debt, is something that has been cast aside a little bit in our time, but is something that's going through a bit of a renaissance today. Another value is caring for the commons, and here's a little excerpt. I like to read this out because it's a nice teaching in the Talmud, and that is that the sages taught a person should not throw stones from his property into the public domain. An incident occurred involving a certain individual who was throwing stones from his property into the public domain, and a certain pious man found him. The latter said to him, "Lowlife, for what reason are you throwing stones from property that is not yours into your property?" The man mocked him, as he did not understand what he meant, as the property from which he was throwing stones was his. Some days later, he was forced to sell his field from which he had thrown the stones, and he was walking in the same public domain into which he had thrown them, and he stumbled on those same stones. He said, "That pious man said it well to me when he said, 'For what reason are you throwing stones from the property that is not yours into your property, since that property no longer belongs to me, and only the public domain remains mine to use?'" And so this is something that perhaps gives us an appreciation of an approach to the commons, that the commons isn't something that belongs to no one in the Jewish lens here, but is something that belongs to everyone and therefore merits being taken care of. This is one of the perhaps the number one teaching that's highlighted by Jewish environmentalists. It comes from the Midrash Haggadah, from Ecclesiastes Rabbah, relatively old text. "Behold God's creation, for who could fix it if it was ruined? At the time when God created the first man, he took him to review each and every tree in the Garden of Eden and told him, 'Behold my creations, how pleasant and praiseworthy they are. All that I created for you. Pay heed that you do not ruin and destroy my world, for if you ruin it, there is no one after you who will fix it.'" And so this is something that really frames things in a relatively easy and palatable thing for our contemporary ears that are sensitive to environmental teachings. Here's a teaching about intrinsic value by Maimonides, one of the most significant Jewish scholars of all of history, writing in the 12th century in his philosophical treatise, Guide for the Perplexed. "I consider, therefore, the following opinion as most correct according to the teaching of the Bible, and best in accordance with the results of philosophy, namely that the universe does not exist for man's sake, but that each being exists for its own sake, and not because of some other thing." And here is the book of moral education, Sefer HaChinuch, one that goes on and to try to give a rational framework to all of Maimonides' commandments that he codified in his Sefer HaMitzvot, and his book of mitzvot, book of commandments. And here is the one that is a rationalization of the prohibition of waste not, bal tashchit. "This is the way of the righteous and people of deeds who love peace and delight in the goodness of human beings and draw them near to the Torah. They do not waste even a grain of mustard in this world. Their instinct when encountering wastefulness and destruction is to try to prevent it with all their strength." Okay, that's the list of teachings that I'm going to go through. But I also want to say that these are collected through a process called resource mining, which is somewhat ironic when we're talking about these teachings as reflecting environmental wisdom found in rich tradition. The reason it's called resource mining is that we take this enormous tradition that has a huge historical and textual wealth and essentially reduce it to a few key teachings that resonate to us in an environmental manner. But even so, all these teachings are ones that don't necessarily have the historical backing to justify their prominence in environmental discourse. For instance, Genesis 2:15, we don't see that the commentators, historical ones that go through, from Rav Saadia Gaon in 10th century all the way up until modern times, that taking care of it wasn't interpreted as you are stewards of the earth, stewards of creation. You must care for all of creation, as it has been in today's environmental movement. That interpretation is a new interpretation. Here we have the sabbatical year. The sabbatical year is essentially something that's now practiced mainly through the signing of documents on what's called a heter mechira, something that allows a Jew in the land of Israel to sell their land to a Gentile so that they can go ahead and keep on working it during the sabbatical year. In fact, and I'll say this is a plug for my doctoral student, Einat Kramer. I'm co-supervising with a colleague of mine, Itai Greenspan at Hebrew University, who is a major environmental activist and is writing their dissertation on sabbatical years. Through some of the research she's uncovered, we have about just over 7,500 different farmsteads in Israel, and about 50 of them practice a full-blown rest of the land. About another 150 have a modified version of it. But point is that it's peanuts. We're talking about if we're talking about the full-blown sabbatical, a fraction of 1%. So it's not really something that's put into place. And of course, things like intrinsic value don't necessarily translate into environmental action. So I want to take you to the study that I'm quite proud of, and I've spent my time at University of Toronto working on building a couple of databases, one on faith communities in the city of Toronto or the Greater Toronto Area, and the other on US synagogues. And surprisingly, the databases are approximately the same size. So it's something that it's been fun to look at some of the ways in which the numbers work. This is just a bit of a religious breakdown. To give you a sense, in globally, according to a Pew Institute study, there's about 84% of all humans on the face of this earth affiliate, at least nominally, with a religion. That's not a measure of religiosity, but at least nominally they self-identify as belonging to a specific religious group. That number is less in Canada, and here we have about 75%, and that number is relatively equally reflected in the GTA. So what did we do? We went and sort of, this is where I can say thank you to the many students who have helped me put together this database. So the first step was just collecting these lists. There's no place that has just a comprehensive list. Well, what's a place of worship? Where should such a list exist? Well, the city of Toronto has a decent one, but it's not really one that's kept updated and isn't necessarily comprehensive. Places of worship come, they go. And so the first step was to actually get a list of what's out there. And we had to consult quite widely a number of different lists. We decided that we should focus specifically on places of worship. There are places where social capital is built meaning is made out of the world, where norms and values are instilled in people, where they're actively working on building community. So once we did that, we started to do a comprehensive search on what's actually going on in these places of worship in terms of their environmental action. And so we would go and sort of use the Google search engine in order to target a site targeted specific search, where we would look up keywords that are related to environmental action and see what it is they were doing. We'd also then do a comprehensive search in each website to see if there was anything that we missed. And then we would take this and we'd code it in the database, depending on what the action was. We did this based on the faith and the common goods, which is the biggest and probably most important faith-based environmental organization operating in Canada. They have a long-standing greening sacred spaces program that specifically targets places of worship and works to build them into green institutions. And so we use their existing framework in order to build the database. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a moment. But essentially what we did is, when we had some sort of indicator of something happening in a particular area, we would note it and we would code it in the specific area, with a few additions of whether that action was internal or external, whether it was internally focused on the community itself, or it was trying to make an impact outside of the individual faith community that it represented. And the other was whether an environmental action was explicit. In other words, was it framed as an environmental action, or was it implicit? Was it something that it can be considered an environmental action but wasn't framed as such? By doing that, we wanted to be as broad as possible to capture as much action as we possibly could. So this is a little bit about what the Greening Sacred Spaces program looks like. They offer 3 different levels of certification. They have different categories, and in each category, there's a number of possible actions that a community can undertake. And if you fulfill the actions in that area, you can then shift to the next level, be certified with the next level up of action. And then you have to take 10 actions in each level in order to get the certification. We reduced this to 4 broad categories that captured the entire range here of worship, community, operations, and environmental justice. And so what do we actually see? What's going on in the GTA? And so this is where it starts to get kind of fun. So one thing that you see is, first is point you to this number at the bottom of the screen and the left. We managed to get to 1,800 plus faith communities. We had to take some out. Any faith community that didn't have an operating website is not one that we could include in our database. And then we were able to, through this, see who's taking action. How are they taking action? And how are they framing the action that they're taking? So as you can see here, 23.5% of all GTA faith communities are taking at least one environmental action. Now, to me, that both strikes me as a huge number and also as a teeny number, right? That means the vast majority of communities are not taking any action. Things to point out here are, it gets perhaps a little tough to make any statistical claims about smaller groups. But when we get to bigger groups, we can see that some differences already pop out just on this initial descriptive table. One is that Jewish communities, and this is something that there is reason to be proud of, are the number one in terms of the percent of communities that take environmental action in the GTA. Not far behind them are Buddhist communities and Protestant mainline communities. And where you see this huge difference in terms of Protestant communities, or when we get to the evangelicals, who have taken an anti-climate change stance in many cases, propelled by politics. We see a much lesser degree of environmental action in evangelical communities. And you can see that for all these communities, less actions are framed explicitly environmental. So you can see the difference between the two columns as something that brings out the environmental actions that are hidden. And just to give you a sense of a bit of a different perspective, how many environmental actions are taken per community. And here, when we get to per community for the Jewish communities, we have 2.82 actions if a community is already environmentally active, and then 1 action per community in the broader sense of all Jewish institutions. And here again, I'll point out that when we see the difference between Protestant evangelical and Protestant mainline, this average number of actions is really stark. But if we're looking at evangelical communities that are taking action, you know, that number goes up, obviously. So I know that this is sort of you know, a rapid go through of what's going on in GTA communities, but this is just to give you a sense. Okay. The next thing that I want to show you is environmental action in US places of worship in synagogues. And here, whereas we see broad strokes, we don't really have a breakdown of denominations in the GTA framework, except a little bit between mainline Protestants and evangelical Protestants. Here, we're already seeing what that might look like in terms of a denominational breakdown. Who's leading the charge in terms of environmental action and who is holding up behind. And here, I would say the results are relatively quite obvious. It's Orthodox communities, of which are 1, largest in number, and least in terms of the proportion of their environmental engagement. This was an interesting finding in terms of formalizing environmental action. One way to do that is through a green team or a climate action team or a social action team that's focused on environment in a place of worship. There simply are not that many in Orthodox communities, and then we have a lot more going on essentially everywhere else. What does that look like in terms of overall actions? Again, the Orthodoxy is not propelling forward the Jewish environmental movement. The average number of actions per Orthodox community is 0.09 actions per community. And we see that this changes a lot once you get into other denominations, like 1.3 per Reconstructionist community, etc. One thing I will point out here is that there's a few things to point out. One, in terms of overall places of worship in the US, there's about 4,300 that we picked up on our database, okay? The vast majority of communities simply did not have an operating website. So there's a limited, we decided simply to not include them in our analysis. It's possible that these communities are the environmental champions. I think that there's good reason to assume that they are not. And a lot of them did belong to Orthodox communities. So it's possible that they're a reflection of what we already see here. So it means it's possible that this number is actually even lower, but it's impossible to say. The other thing I will say is that not every action we capture using this methodology. It's impossible. Only an action that's described on a website is one that we would capture using this method. And so it's possible that the communities are a lot more engaged, and we're simply not able to capture that. But this is a lens into what's going on at the level of place of worship. In other words, how much are those declarations by faith leaders actually trickling down and impacting people of faith in specific communities? This should give you just a bit of a sense in terms of comparing the databases. The US synagogue data is very skewed by the Orthodox communities, and so it really brings down the entire data set. And as such, it makes it very similar in terms of the general GTA data set. But if we look at the synagogues in the GTA, they do stand out as taking a relatively high proportion of the action. This gives you just a bit of a different view in terms of the areas of action. What are the things that people are championing? What are the types of activities in the paper that's emerging from this? We go into a little bit about why we think some actions are highlighted by specific groups and not others, but it's not something that we really have a chance to go into today. But we can see that some take a little bit of a different have higher levels than others. If we look at that, just again in terms of Orthodox communities, just want to highlight this is relative to the U.S. average. Like, they're really pulling down the numbers for the U.S. average on every single level, except for promoting car alternatives. Who knew? The other thing to keep in mind with this data set is that it's not a measure of what's the most impactful action that any individual can have, right? This is a measure, essentially, of it's just a bean counter, right? It's one type of way of looking at these things, and to see which one has the greatest type, what action reduces someone's carbon footprints to the highest extent, we'd look at this a little bit differently. We might start to rank the different types of actions, and that's something that we're thinking about in terms of the next steps of where to take this database. The other thing that we're looking at currently is going in and getting the why behind this story. This is a lot of the what, and now we need to really understand the why, because that helps in terms of looking at this in terms of planning, of policy, of ways of operationalizing this to a higher level, to broader levels. And so this doesn't explain the why, but my current SHRC project is looking at the why, where we actually go into faith communities, we speak to the faith leader, we speak to lay leaders, and try to start to understand what the complexity is behind what we see in these types of graphs. Now, I certainly wouldn't want you to leave this talk with the impression that orthodox environmentalism is something that doesn't exist. It does exist. It's something that meets more barriers than other forms of denominational environmentalism, but things are happening. And I want to give you just a couple of the more promising avenues where we see environmental action. Letters with signatories appealing to, this one specifically appeals to the broader community. This one is from Israel. All the signatories here belong to Orthodox communities, and they are they've issued this letter. It's already a couple years old, but they issued this letter leading up to the Jewish holy days and the month of festivals in the month of Tishrei. So, September, October, for those of you who follow the Gregorian calendar, making an appeal using the value and the ethic and the law, and we can sort of mush those all together, of Bal Tashchit, of waste not, asking people to either eliminate or reduce to the extent possible their reliance on single-use plastics during the festival months. The very fact that we have so many high-profile signatories means that this thing can have a trickle-down effect into communities of practice. More recently, and the one here is that this one was actually led by not a faith-based environmental organization, but one of the leading activist environmental organizations in Israel called Green Course, or Megama Yeruka. And another letter, just much more recently released, is an appeal to Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, Prime Minister of the State of Israel, leading up to the to COP26 in Glasgow, calling for action and fueled by different types of Jewish values, and talking about a moral responsibility to act. And again, a wide range of different signatories on this letter. And this one was pushed forward by Teva Ivri, Jewish Nature, and this is the organization founded by my doctoral student Einat Kramer. And one of the keys is also understanding that in order to bring more people to the table, we have to think of environmentalism in broad strokes, seeing that not everybody comes to the table pushed by the same values. They're not all motivated by the same thing. And so having only one type of language to bring them to the table is something that would essentially make a declaration of paucity for the environmental movement. Whereas we would want to see something that's entirely the opposite. Bring in a much wider range of values that can bring different communities to the table. And here you see members of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel again, making an appeal for people to keep, to not litter, concerned with the value of cleanliness. And this is something that we see in conservative environmental communities, that they care about cleanliness, about pollution, about purity. And that might be a different language than the one that speaks about caring for creation and stewardship and responsibility. So this is something to keep in mind, that perhaps one of the reasons where we see less action is because this language hasn't been activated to the extent that it's possible yet. And operationalizing it is something that could bring that out a little bit more. So I'm going to stop here. And I haven't seen any of the Q&A here, but I'm sure that there's some good questions here, and I'd be looking forward to addressing them and chatting about it further.
Thank you so much, Tanhum. That was really wonderful. That was a lot of what, and I'm looking forward to the next talk about the why, the sociological analysis. I myself have a lot of questions. I'll save those questions for now because we get to the questions in the Q&A. But you did remind me how New York City has instituted a policy of introducing literature about recycling in Yiddish to reach the Hasidic communities. And there's, it's quite remarkable. There's the whole thing. We didn't even talk about language. You talk about language at the end, but that language itself is a question at all. This, how do you appeal to these people? How do you appeal to people? Okay, so I'm going to now open up the Q&A questions here. I skimmed them as you were talking. I'm going to start with the questions that have more to do specifically with religion and the environment, or Judaism and the environment, rather than those that have to do with broad questions that are just about the environment that are not necessarily focused on religious faith. So, and if we have some time, we can come back to those. And of course, I apologize to anyone whose questions or comments I don't get to. Firstly, let me just say it before I forget. This lecture is recorded. It's available on York's YouTube channel, on the Center for Jewish Studies YouTube channel. But I think if you want the PowerPoint presentation, the slides, I think you're going to have to write to Tanhum personally to ask him for them, because we don't have the ability to present that. But you know, you can get in touch with him. And if you have any trouble getting in touch with him, we'll be happy to give you his contact information. Okay, so the first question that I'm going to ask is about Maimonides. And this is actually something that occurred to me too, because I was a little bit unclear about Maimonides' position. The question is, doesn't the quote you shared from Maimonides contradict? And the questioner says, perhaps that's too strong a terminology, but there seems to be some level of contradiction between that slide with the statement from Maimonides and the quote from Ecclesiastes. Could you give us some more context to Maimonides' position about the environment and how it's been interpreted?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, so I would say, yes, I do. I am aware that some of these teachings that I used to highlight environmental values and of course, thank you for the question, to highlight environmental values might, as individual teachings, contradict each other on a specific level, but still work to build up this portfolio of environmental wisdom found in the Jewish traditions. So again, this is a matter of different worldviews. What brings someone to the table, or this is at least how I see it. And you know, some people come to the table because they really care about creation. They're concerned with the intrinsic value of things. And you know, this is perhaps what we can see coming out in Maimonides' teaching. You know, one interesting activity would be to see how that specific approach might echo later on in Maimonides' work. It's not something that I've done, but certainly something that I've thought about a little bit, because how does one teaching, is that the teaching that ends up influencing all of Maimonides' way of looking at the Jewish traditions? Probably not, but simultaneously, like the quote from Ecclesiastes is a very anthropocentric and human-targeted framing of environmental responsibility. Right? It's one that says everything is for you, human. Like, really sort of speaks up the role of the human in the hierarchy of creation, and simultaneously, it's saying, use that position of dominion and your role as someone who has power here in order to guide the world in positive ways and not destructive ways. And so it's not something that's concerned with intrinsic value. It's really concerned about how the world, and this again, we can see this in the book of moral education. It's not concerned with intrinsic value. It's concerned with the human, how it can build up one's moral character. Are you going to be someone who navigates the world as someone who does good in the world, or are you going to be a destroyer? And does that mean that the tree needs to have value beyond that? No. It's nice if it does, but that specific teaching isn't tied into it. So yeah, these things contradict each other. Specific, very interesting, even considering the fact that the book of moral education is essentially a commentary on Maimonides' book of commandments. So it's like one where we see Maimonides teaching about intrinsic value, and then when we see about not destroying, not wasting, is something that's framed entirely in human terms. So that addresses it a little bit, but certainly there's more depth to go into there. And thank you for the question.
Okay, so the next question I'm going to ask is, could you speak more about Jewish religious fatalism? What does this sound like, and where does it come from?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for it. So I haven't. I've encountered it a little bit in my work, and this goes back to work that I've done in ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel and in Canada, and so one is that I was once interviewing someone on a bus traveling from Jerusalem to Har Meron to partake in Lag BaOmer festivities, and I thought this was a great opportunity because the bus is full of members of the ultra-Orthodox communities to engage in some research, and this is some stuff that I was doing for a project on ecological footprints, and interviewing someone, and we talked about the number of children that they had, and one was like, we started talking about it. It's asking me like, why are you asking this question? Why is it something that's interesting? And we started talking about the impact of each individual human on the planet, and essentially the person ended up dismissing all of this because everything is in the hands of God, right? Everything is already shaped, so it doesn't make a difference if somebody has one child or 10 children. So that's one way it's played out. I've also seen it in terms of thinking about time frames, and this sort of ties possibly a little bit more into the type of apocalyptic thinking that really is, it is connected in some ways to religious fatalism, where you start to talk to, this came through in an interview, about people in ultra-Orthodox communities about recycling, and like, why should you recycle as opposed to throwing something out? Well, plastic, it doesn't biodegrade, so in order for it to biodegrade, it's like thousands of years, and like that time frame was completely meaningless to this individual, because that's not the time frame that this individual sees the world in. And so that's, using that argument in order to try to motivate a change in behavior for this particular individual, representing perhaps the view of other people in their community, is something that doesn't work, and a different approach needs to happen. So, for instance, that final slide, if we tie in, the need to recycle into issues of cleanliness, pollution, that's something that might resonate a lot more than saying plastic doesn't biodegrade. So those are two examples that hopefully help clarify that a little bit.
Okay, I'm going. You raise an important point that I hope you'll address in a future talk: the connection between secular education, economic status, and attitudes. Right, that's a huge topic. And the questions I'm going to ask you now are in a certain way related to this. These are two distinct questions, but I think they're intimately related. One question is about, how do you measure the relation to the environment per community? In a sense, you ask a bunch of discrete questions about what people do, but that's not always about, doesn't capture everything, right? How do you measure this at relationships? And the second question is actually about what you're counting and how you counted it. I'm interested in the GTA database. How much effort or time was it to produce? I'm assuming the answer is a lot, but you can tell us better.
Yeah, I might have to ask you to repeat the first question, but let me address the second one first. Then, so Thank you for the question. A ton of time, more time than I'd like to admit, and the help of more than a handful of students. And this is something that I've been working on for years, because partially it's propelled by what Ron Taylor calls the greening of religion hypothesis. It's essentially looking at, are religions actually starting to engage in environmental behavior? We certainly have one school of thought coming out of Yale with Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm that says, this is a huge movement. This is change that's happening, and this is something that that essentially is a new force in the world of environmentalism. And the other one looks at it a little bit more scientifically and tries to see, is this actually happening? What's going on? What's this change? Excuse me. And so this is an attempt to, one, document what's happening at the level of places of worship, where we get to the broadest number of people represented in terms of a faith-based framework, because of course a faith-based environmental organization is obviously going to frame things environmentally, and they'll do their best to make these connections highlighted and seem incredibly important, and do all they can to elevate the place of faith-based environmentalism within the framework of environmentalism, generally speaking. So part of this is to get that baseline. Once we have a baseline, we can say, we can go back, and 5-10 years from now, when presumably a lot has happened in the world, both in terms of our environmental activism, our environmental action, changes in the discourse, changes in climate changes, all sorts of changes, go back and see. Are we actually seeing that there's more environmental action in faith communities using the same types of metrics? Is it the same? Is it stagnated? And so this is one important way of measuring that, and it's not intrusive. In other words, anyone can do it and collect the information, right? So you can go back and just recreate this is all publicly available. And this is how we collected. We didn't have to buy any data sets. We didn't have to get permission from anyone to look at an individual place of worship's website. And so it's just a matter of time. And so I started this project conceptualizing it. And obviously it's sort of had ebbs and flows and different funding challenges and whatnot, but I've started this towards the end of 2017, and so we're at more towards the beginning of 2022, and there are still plenty of work to be done, and this is what But once the data set exists, you can take it to the next level. For instance, how does this tie into political identity and socioeconomic status? Start to map this out using using census data. And start to see, is there a particular, is political identity a more relevant factor than religious identity in terms of determining whether a community acts or does not act? Does it determine the socioeconomic status, determine whether a community does a particular type of pro-environmental action or another? So there's all sorts of interesting directions that can go in. And sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to repeat the first question, Coleman.
The first question, I'm going to read it. I mean, I to some extent interpreted it. But I'll read it the way it's written. How do you measure the relation to the environment per community?
Per community, okay. I mean, so again, this study is not a measure of individual community members. It's a measure about how the community acts through their place of worship. Now, that's another interesting study to do. Is there a knock-on effect? Are we actually seeing that the values that might be promoted in a particular place of worship, do they actually resonate? Do people say, oh, yeah, this is important for me. This is something that the imam said, that the rabbi said, that the priest said, whoever, and I'm going to take this home. I'm going to start thinking about how I engage and use the world differently based on these types of teachings. So it's tough to say how much of a knock-on effect it has. Hopefully we'll get to that in future studies. And again, it's only one lens into viewing what specific communities do, because there's going to be details that are missing in the database, right? Not every single action that you do in a community is something that is then translated to being put on the website. And so we're going to miss a lot. But we also think that this is a way of capturing and presenting the information in a way that creates something from nothing. And so now we have a way that we can look at it. And hopefully, when we think about recreating the study 5-10 years down the road and seeing what changes have happened, we'll have different tools at our disposal. We'll be able to think a little bit differently about how we're collecting the information, and then parts of this will help us make the information that we're able to share afterwards and the findings a little bit more complex. We do some of this, and hopefully a paper will emerge shortly. We're in a revise and resubmit on the GTA database paper, and hopefully some of the questions about relationships between particular actions and what that looks like on the broad sense of religions in the GTA will come to light through that, and you'll be able to check it out.
Now, your questions, obviously your work here was focused primarily on the GTA, but this is a question that goes beyond the GTA. Considering your discussion with Orthodox Jews, today, about 80 years after the Holocaust, there are just over 15 million Jews in the world. Would you have the same discussion with people from Africa or Asia, where it is common to have many children, right? The question of large family size.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the interesting questions that challenges the world of environmentalism, and we can certainly have different approaches, different opinions, and we have different worldviews with this regard. Right? It's I almost want to say it's like environmental movement orthodoxy to say that we need less people in this world because of the impact that we have. But simultaneously, you always see like the opposite in some versions of faith-based environmentalism. I'll point to Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, where he specifically addresses this and says it's not about the number of people. Get off the population reduction argument. It's about how people use the world. It's about consumption, and so this is something that that divides different approaches to environmentalism. I'll refer you to a study done by Yaakov Garb. It's called the Shadow Report. It was on ultra-Orthodox communities. It's dated already. It's probably closing in on 20 years old, but it was looking specifically at ultra-Orthodox communities and asking questions like, okay, so if we look at this family of 10 versus this family of 3 or 4, and we look at average consumption, family of 3 or 4 might be consuming a lot per capita, whereas the family of 10 might be consuming very little per capita. On a generational, looking at this right now, at this one point in time, we might say, well, these 10 have a lower impact than these 3 or 4. But then when you look at it generationally and say, well, these 3 or 4, had, their family is like growing kind of like almost below replacement level population-wise, and then this family is all 10 kids have, or 8 kids have 8 kids, or all 10 kids have 10 kids, and then we start to see that small impact increases and it becomes a huge impact in terms of population size. To me, I don't take a position on this, but where I do take a position is saying that is an indicator of the urgency of operationalizing and motivating communities that might have a higher birth rate to become part of this environmental movement and having the environments in mind when they navigate how to use the world.
Okay, well, I think we have time for maybe one more question. So I'm saving this very difficult question. Well, I think it's difficult. Maybe it's not to you. This is a question that goes beyond specifically the tie between religion and environmentalism. And I'll read it. Every energy system, whether alternative such as nuclear, hydro, etc., or renewable such as solar PV or wind turbine, was and continues to be created using fossil fuel almost exclusively. How will we ever be fossil free with or without faith?
I guess the with or without faith is the it's a universal question. I don't have a good answer to that. This isn't my field. It's not my area. I'm hopeful though, and I do think that if the way in which we I don't think that the energy systems that we have are inherently necessary for there to be fossil fuel input. I think that's something that's done because it's easy and it's cheap, and it's easy also to catalyze renewable energies with fossil fuels, and so it's done. And there's a challenge of electricity versus liquid fuels for mobile fleets. It's a challenging question. It's one of the biggest questions that we face as humans. For me, I look at it as something like, on an individual level, be mindful. On an institutional level or a societal level, we need to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, right? There's and so I'm inspired when people can go and take that step for whatever reason, and when in my area of research, when it comes and is connected to faith-based environmental activism and a way of reducing human impact on the earth through this type of lens, I say awesome. But I also say that, as you put it right at the end with that question, faith or no faith, it doesn't make a difference. This is just one way in. So, and even within a faith-based framework, there's not one way in. There needs to be as many ways in as possible, and so the more, the merrier. And that's essentially the key to pushing forward a full-on transition from a society that's sustainable, that's not sustainable, to a society that is sustainable and resilient, and that can combat the different crises of the world. And we know that we can come together when we decide to. We see it when we have when we approach different crises, whether it's the pandemic or the war in Ukraine. So we can mobilize as humans to create positive change. We have to choose to, and it's difficult, but we can do it.
Okay, on that note, I'm going to thank you. Thank you. I thank you personally for joining us today, and I thank you in the name of the center. And I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today. This was a wonderful talk, and we look forward to posting it on our website. And Yes, we invite you to tune in for other sessions here at the Center for Jewish Studies. If you're not already affiliated with the center or receive our mailing list, please send us a letter, send us an email, and we'll sign you up. And there's a lot to look forward to, and we look forward to having Tanhum return in the future.
Thank you very much for having me. Be well.